Hello, my name is Angela Boateng. I am General Counsel for the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Welcome to the Hahnemann University Hospital St. Christopher's Bankruptcy Update. And this is actually part 2 of a series of webinars that the Medical Society and the stakeholders have hosted. I'm joined today by several presenters who will highlight several points of information during today's presentation. Our presenters today include Mark Osterberry, Executive Director of the Philadelphia County Medical Society, Dr. David Eisenberg, Associate Professor of Medicine at the Drexel University College of Medicine, Karen E. Davidson from the law offices of Karen Davidson, Jeremy Ryan from Potter Adderson and Caroon, Claire Shearer, Senior Director of Membership and Communications and County Relations with the Pennsylvania Medical Society, and Brian Vanderberg, General Counsel of the American Medical Association. Before we begin, I'd like to start off with this disclaimer. Every effort has been made to provide complete and accurate information. However, please be advised that this is a rapidly evolving situation. The stakeholders make no warranties, expressed or implied, as to the accuracy of the content of the information provided. The inclusion of the insurance brokers, agents, and companies do not constitute or imply endorsement, recommendation, or favoring of the stakeholders on this webinar. The information provided is for informational purposes only and is not intended and should not be construed to constitute legal advice. As always, we advise that you seek your own legal counsel for the application of facts specific to your circumstance. With that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mark Osterberry. Mark?
Good morning. Thanks for participating in our webinar today. And again, I wanted to call out the specifics of these organizations that have been involved from the get-go. Obviously, the County Medical Society, the Pennsylvania Medical Society, the American Medical Association, the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, and the Association of American Medical Colleges. In addition, we've been continuing to build that coalition. Other medical specialist associations have now expressed an interest to join or help or assist, so they will be added as necessary. Next slide. Today we're going to have our goals are again to provide an update for the Hahnemann St. Chris's residents, fellows, and attendings. We may use a term that says Hahnemann, but we haven't forgotten about the St. Chris's individuals. And also to provide information, guidance, and direction on this presentation. I do want to remind everybody that today, not only the residents and the fellows are paying a keen attention to this, but we also will probably be talking to the designated institutional officers, the administrators, government officials, in addition to medical liability insurance companies and others. So we're trying to provide as inclusive information to everybody as we can. Next slide. We were going to go through some background again. We did have a first webinar that was held on December 18th. We'll give you a little update of that. Also talk about the legal update, the shareholders activity, update on insurance carriers that are MCARE ineligible, the next steps for the DIOs and the institutions, an overview of the frequent asked questions and the next steps. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Eisenberg to give us a background of where we are.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone, and thanks for participating in our webinar. And thanks again to all of the organizations who've taken a lead in really advocating on behalf of everyone who's been affected by this crisis. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of background, which is a little redundant from our previous webinar, but we'll go through it briefly. As many of you know, both hospitals, Hahnemann and St. Chris's, was sold in January 2018 to PAHS. And at that time, the insurance that organization purchased was a claims-made policy, which is different than the previous owners. The previous owners had an occurrence-based policy for trainees and attendings. On June 30th of this year, the organization filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and physicians, which included residents, fellows, and attendings, were displaced from employment. Excuse me. At that time, the decision was made that the claims made policy would be terminated at a certain time. And the issue that we're dealing with today is that the physicians are at risk for not having malpractice, professional liability, or tail insurance at the end of the policy period. Previously, it was January 10th, 2020, and we'll tell you a little bit about the extension, but currently the end date is February 10th, 2020. Next slide. So who is affected? A lot of people are affected. Let's start with Hahnemann physicians. So Hahnemann physicians, including residents, fellows, and attendings, if you were employed at any time between January 10th, 2018 and September 6th, 2019, which was the hospital closure date, then you are affected. Even if you were only at Hahnemann for a short period of time, so new interns or new fellows, even though you were only there for a few weeks, this does affect you and you would be open for liability. In the other thing that I just wanted to note for both Hahnemann and St. Christopher's, the end date is whenever, if you transferred to another training site or another program, or you became employed by another organization, then that would be your end date. So it's whenever you were employed by PAHS. For St. Christopher residents, fellows, and attendings, if you trained between January 10th and December 14th, then this affects you if you left St. Chris before the transfer of the hospital to Tower and Drexel. So if you left on December 13th, 2019, before the transition to Tower Drexel, then you are affected. If you stayed on and you're currently training at St. Chris, then you are okay. And again, just like at Hahnemann, if you were only there for a short period of time, you are still affected. And just to emphasize, Tower Health will provide malpractice insurance for trainees who are still employed at the time of transition between AHS to Tower Drexel. Next slide. As I said, a lot of people are affected. A challenge that we have faced is that we actually don't have an absolute complete list of who is affected. And so we really would encourage you to spread the word by mouth, by social media, however you have contact with your colleagues. We estimate that about 1,400 individuals are affected at Hahnemann, more than 100 attending, 560 residents and fellows who were orphaned and who went to other institutions to complete their training, and then 400 residents and fellows who previously trained and left the programs either because they graduated or left for any other reason are affected. At St. Chris, again, these are estimates, about 60 residents and fellows who previously trained, and then 15 attendings who were previously on staff. Again, this is an estimate. And just a cautionary note, individuals are affected even though employment contracts state that occurrence or tail coverage would be purchased. This is something that is being brought up in the courts. And so do not think that just because your contract said that you had one type of insurance, that the company actually purchased that type of insurance. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Angela to discuss the next issue.
Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg. And as Dr. Eisenberg pointed out, and we mentioned at the beginning of the call, this is the second of a two-part series of webinars on this issue. We felt it important to provide that background information for those of you who are joining for the first time on this call. But we do encourage, or webinar rather, we do encourage you to view the first presentation as it contains additional information that will be helpful and informative to you as you navigate this particular issue. So having said that, the reason why all of this is very important is because of the importance of obtaining medical professional liability to practice, not only in Pennsylvania, but many other states. In Pennsylvania, all physicians must maintain professional liability insurance. It is important to note that Pennsylvania is not alone in this requirement. There are numerous other states that have this licensure requirement or insurance as a condition of licensure in their states. So affected physicians who are training or employed in another state should really check the insurance requirements in that state to make sure they do not run afoul of that particular requirement. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our colleagues at the American Medical Association, Jeremy and Ryan.
Jeremy, why don't you go? Jeremy, go ahead.
This is Jeremy Ryan of Potter Anderson Caruna. I'll give you a brief update on where we are in the legal proceedings from the last time we had the webinar. The hearing that had been continued to January 6th was continued to January 31st of this year, so the hearing did not occur yet. One of the conditions to gaining that extension or extension of the hearing date was that Hahnemann did obtain a 30-day extension of the malpractice policy for both Hahnemann and St. Chris's affected people and actually the entire organizations. So the next scheduled date for the hearing is January 31st. In the meantime, we continue to have settlement discussions with Hahnemann, and Hahnemann has also tried to engage major stakeholders beyond those on this call, but major stakeholders in the healthcare community in Philadelphia about trying to seek more global solutions or broader solutions rather than individual solutions. And those discussions continue. We're hopeful that they may lead to a positive result, but as with last webinar, we can't guarantee any of that, and then every resident must continue to proceed as if they have to obtain tail coverage on their own. But we will continue with those negotiations. We have also opened discussions with the PAJUA to try and bridge the gap between them and the Department of Insurance on the Joint Underwriters Association's offers to help with some of this crisis, and so we're exploring that option as well. I also wanted to let you know many of you received motions in mid to late December from Hahnemann that sought to reject your employment contracts. I understand that some of the allegations in there were incorrect and were upsetting. Hahnemann has put a correction on the bankruptcy court docket with respect to some of their incorrect allegations as to how your employment was terminated. Those motions all had a response deadline. As part of the continuing agreements to not have a hearing on the motion that the ad hoc committee filed, Hahnemann has continued to agree that those motions do not need to be responded to, and the current agreement is that a response would not be due until February 7th, 1 week after our next scheduled hearing on the motion that the ad hoc committee filed. If we extend the hearing date on January 31st again, we will again request a further extension. The ad hoc committee is exploring whether it can file an objection on behalf of all residents, but the ad hoc committee cannot file objections on behalf of individual residents. I also want to bring to your attention that if you do wish to file an objection, you'll either need to do it on your own or hire your own counsel to get assistance, but that the legal standard under which Hahnemann has filed these motions is very deferential to Hahnemann, and it's a difficult motion to defeat based on those legal standards. Brian, do you have anything else to update?
No, not on the legal front. Thank you, Jeremy. I will, however, preview a little bit and amplify something that Jeremy shared relative to the need for displaced residents and fellows to continue to pursue tail coverage on their own while we as a group continue to pursue some global solution to this issue. In the presentation today, we'll talk a little bit later about the avenues by which you might pursue coverage. That said, we recognize that in some cases, some of you may not be in a position financially to cover the premium costs. So one of the things that we've done in anticipation of that potential circumstance is put in place a financing arrangement with an organization called Laurel Road. And Laurel Road is an organization with whom the AMA has a relationship for student refinancing, loan refinancing, and we have worked with them to put in place a specific loan program for the Hahnemann situation, whereby you would be eligible to secure a loan for purposes of paying the premium on tail coverage insurance in the event that you are required to obtain that personally. On the screen, you'll see the details of what that looks like. For residents and fellows, there is an opportunity to borrow up to $45,000 for purposes of funding the premium costs of the required tail coverage. There is no prepayment penalty, so in the event that you pursue that and then a global solution is arrived at, you aren't penalized in any way by either not proceeding with the loan or by prepaying it if in fact you take care of it. Key feature here is that because of the timing in processing these loans, we do encourage you, if you're in the situation where you may need financing to cover the cost of premiums, to please start this process now. Whether you ultimately take advantage of it or not is a separate issue, but there is a little bit of time in processing these, particularly given the volume of individuals affected. So we would encourage you, if this is something that is attractive to you, to please start the process now, get it in play, so that you're in a position and you've got the optionality to take it or not. AMA members receive a discount on that. No obligation to be a member of the AMA to take advantage of this financing opportunity, but I will highlight that. Again, we'll talk a little bit further in the webinar about how you might go about pursuing tail coverage independently, but we wanted to highlight that there is a financing opportunity in connection with that up front. So with that, I'll turn it back.
Thanks, Brian. You know, the stakeholders, as we had talked about earlier, the AMA, the organized medicine, if you're listening to this webinar and you think that you have something to add or contribute to the direction of where we should be, by all means, please contact us. The other thing is that we've been engaged with government officials, the Pennsylvania Insurance Department, the governor's office, the MCARE people, medical liability companies. We've set up a loan program. We've done a lot of background or detailed information. And we are here, we're still trying to organize and still trying to direct you to do the best thing that we think, or that we're trying to provide guidance to you, I should say. Anyway, I'm going to turn it back over now to David to talk about medical professional liability carrier update. Next slide.
Thanks, Mark. Just a couple updates on the carriers. It's a really complicated issue, and I have personally learned so much about malpractice insurance, more than I would ever want to know. But one of the more recent things that came to our attention a few weeks ago was the fact that many of you were unable to obtain quotes for your entire training period, or parts of your training period, because you were told that you were not participating in MCARE. Next slide, please. And thankfully, there are starting to be some carriers that are willing to provide quotes and actually insure you if you were, quote unquote, MCARE ineligible. We're not going to get into the details of what MCARE is, because there are many books written on this. But suffice it to say, there is a carrier now that will actually provide you a quote, and you can find that information by going to the website listed here. And there are multiple brokers and carriers that are listed there. I want to reiterate that we are not endorsing any of these brokers or carriers. We're just providing information. And we've spoken to some of these people and really explained the problem so that they understand the problem, and they're coming up with solutions kind of on their own with our guidance. But if you go to this link and then you actually click on a link within that web page, Claims Made Insurance Primer for Residents and Fellows, there's a table there that actually lists all of these brokers and carriers. And there's one in particular that is now handling MCARE ineligible trainees. And so I just wanted to highlight that because we received a lot of questions on where we can find this list. Next slide. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark.
Thanks. Again, your designated institutional officers and the receiving institutions, we can't thank you enough for helping the residents and providing information and continuing to be a conduit for what we're trying to do. We continue to work with the AAMC and as well as the ACGME on information to sort of push out to them, because we are still, as we mentioned before, we're still trying to develop an accurate list of the more than 1,200 people that would be affected by this crisis. Next slide. A little bit of background. We did go out and send a letter out back in the beginning of December to all the designated institutional officers for consideration about trying to help assist with medical liability insurance, or if they could look into it. We also advised them of the gap in the coverage. They had responded back. Some continued to respond back well after the December 17th date. The next step, which we need to discuss with the leadership, we've learned of a concern that may be a continuation of funding, the federal government funding for the residents and the fellows, if by some chance the tail coverage wouldn't be provided in the future. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela and Andrew for frequently asked questions.
Thank you, Mark. We've mentioned several times the initial webinar, part 1 of this 2-part series that's available on the Hahnemann website. On December 18th, we had a webinar, obviously, and several questions were submitted post-webinar about this particular issue. Questions like, what is MCARE? Dr. Eisenberg talked a little bit about the intricacies, or mentioned that there are several intricacies related to this particular law. Too much to go into depth in this on this webinar, but in the FAQ, you will find some background information about what exactly MCARE is and how it applies to this particular situation. Another frequently asked question is, when is a resident considered MCARE eligible or MCARE ineligible? For a lot of the physicians affected by this situation, this is a very crucial distinction that is impacting their ability to obtain tail insurance. So the answer to that question is also included in the FAQ. These and several other questions are outlined in the documents and the materials that we have online. I strongly encourage you to visit the PAMed website to find this and other information that might, again, be helpful as you try to navigate this very important situation. Next slide, please. With that, I'll turn it back over to Karen and Mark for next steps.
Thank you, Angela. Hello, everybody. So what we try to do here is distill down for you some information so that you can make your own decisions around sort of how you want to proceed. And the first thing we want to say, which we've said a few times already in this webinar, is to pay attention to your email, pay attention to the news and developments, and keep checking the PAMed website, because there'll be updates regularly there for you. As Dr. Eisenberg mentioned, please continue to spread the word to colleagues, and as Mark mentioned, because we don't have a definitive list. Again, if you are somebody joining this webinar and you were not part of the first webinar or didn't see that webinar, go ahead and get in touch with the Pennsylvania Medical Society and make sure that your name is added. You can do it through the FAQs by adding a question there. So basically what we're trying to focus on here in terms of next steps to think about is the process, the on the ground, what happens. So, you know, as mentioned in that first webinar, we still continue to recommend that you get a loss run report. And if you haven't already done that, here's the contact information for the folks that you need to get in touch with, depending on the dates and when you were at either Hahnemann or St. Chris. We understand that the process there is maybe a few business days in order to get turned around and get that quote. So the other thing we also wanted to reiterate that was mentioned in the first webinar is that if you get any notice of a claim or you have any inkling that there may be a claim that could come up, you want to go back to the PAMed's handout about the tail coverage and get in touch with the RRG, and the contact information for Linda Ramsey is on that handout. So that again will, as Angela had explained in the first webinar, that will perhaps get you protected as long as you sort of disclose that claim. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So in terms of malpractice tail coverage quotes, again, as Dr. Eisenberg mentioned, there are indications, the different carriers and brokers that you could contact. The reason that we have highlighted here to make sure your quote covers the entire period is that we have heard of some folks who have not actually gotten a quote for the entire period. For some reason, they received their quote in maybe the first 6 months, and our suspicions are that it's possible that they might have been quote unquote MCare ineligible for that first 6 month period, and therefore the quote was only for the period when they became MCare eligible. So you want to make sure that there isn't a gap there. Also, in terms of the loss run reports, we want to make sure that the folks that are out there that may have actually straddled 2 periods of time. So we've heard that there would be another category of people. There's the MCare ineligibles and the MCare eligibles, but there are some people that may have straddled both. And so, again, that's another area that we're trying to figure out a global solution for. And in terms of the quotes, we're still in the process of trying to determine and get some guidance from the Pennsylvania Insurance Department as to what the limits are. And so, again, we want to encourage you to work with a broker, and that will help you with that process. And when you get your quote, you want to make sure, sort of determine how long your quote is valid for. And so now we're looking at that February 10th, 20 date as sort of that end date. And so check and see how long your quote is valid for. And all of this plays into sort of the fluid nature of the situation, right? And how you would go ahead and sort of make decisions for yourself about where your comfort level is depending on what you see happening in terms of what the stakeholders are giving you as information, and other sorts of things along those lines. And then next slide, please. And then as Brian mentioned, in terms of looking for a loan to pay for the tail coverage, again, also part of that decision making, but my recommendation to anybody would be get your ducks in a row, and that way you're in a position to make your decision about when and if you want to pull the trigger on the coverage, and also consulting with your own attorney depending on your particular circumstances. We've been informed that, as Brian mentioned, it could take some time to get the approval, and we've heard of it being possibly 30 days to closing on the loan. So the sooner you can get that process started, the better off you'll be. Thank you, and I guess I'll turn that over to Angela now.
Thank you, Karen. We're going to sort of wrap up this webinar with highlighting the resources that are available to all on this particular issue. Since I would say the end of November, beginning of December, the Medical Society, the Philadelphia County Medical Society, the AMA, and the various stakeholders on this call and in this effort have developed a number of different resources and materials to help guide the affected physicians, the physicians affected by this issue. One of the documents that was developed for this issue is an issue brief, sort of primer on claims-made insurance for residents and fellows affected by the Hahnemann closure. There's also a similar brief for attending physicians who have found themselves in the same circumstance. Now, though, again, as Mark mentioned, we reference Hahnemann in this document. A lot of the guidance that is provided is also applicable to the physicians from St. Christopher. I think that this issue brief, claims-made insurance primer, serves as a really good sort of roadmap, a very good broad overview of the issue, what claims-made insurance means, and what steps you can take to help protect yourself. So this information is located on the PA Med website, www.pamed.org/Hahnemann. On that website, you will also find the recording for the December 18th webinar that we've referenced a number of times during this recording and presentation. So we again strongly suggest that you refer back to that information to get the full flavor of everything that's happened and all the resources that are available to you and what next steps you should consider. With that, I want to also reference the PA Med Hahnemann University Hospital Closure website and turn it over to our Director of Communications, Claire Shearer, to talk a little bit about this site and the resources available on it.
Thank you, Angela. I think everybody's done a great job of focusing everybody back to this site where we are putting everything we know. So of course there's unanswered questions, and the stakeholders continue to work towards solutions and answers to those questions. As soon as we get them, that's where we're putting them at pamedstock.org/Hahnemann. So I encourage you to check that regularly. You see there the what's on your mind. That is that email comes directly to me. And we're keeping track of what are the questions. Are there new questions out there? Are there things we haven't answered yet, which we know there are? So I just can encourage everybody to continue to check there. The other way to ensure that you are on the list, so to speak, is to join PA Med, and residents may join for free. So to go to pamedstock.org/join, you can join PA Med for free. That ensures that we know who you are, you're on the list, and you will continue to get those notices as we work through the issues here. So that's it. Thank you so much, Angela. And I just, again, encourage everybody to check back regularly.
Thank you, Claire. And as Claire noted, to submit additional questions and find up-to-date information, please make sure that you visit the pamedstock.org Hahnemann website, and we will make sure that all that information is up-to-date and available for you to access. On behalf of all of the stakeholders on this call today, we thank you for your participation. If there's anything else that you need to know or any questions that you have, please feel free to reach out to us, and we thank you for your time.